So I'm Josh. These are other guys to be named later. And we're not another AI presentation. So throughout our presentation, we're going to start off by giving you a brief background about AI and its implementation into society. And then we're going to discuss like tests and problems, or philosophical tests and problems with its implementation into society. So AI was formally introduced in 1956 by professors at Dartmouth College. The idea of the AI was there beforehand, but it was more formally introduced then. And once it was introduced, the idea of it kind of spread to other colleagues and professionals and raised questions like, where can this be applied to, how far can it go, and can it ever reach the point of human intelligence? So the first person to really tackle the last question was Alan Turing, and he devised a test based on the imitation game. And the imitation game is a game in which you have an interrogator and you have two people in another room. And the interrogator's goal is to determine the other two people in the room, which one is a man and which one is a woman, and based on their written responses to questions that he asks them. And so Alan Turing decided to create a variation of this game in which he determined whether an interrogator would determine whether the people in the other room, or I guess the person in the room, was a computer or an actual other person. And so based on whether a computer could convince the interrogator whether it was a person or not, was how Alan would evaluate its intelligence. And so if a computer could, so he concluded from this test that if a computer could have the ability to convince the interrogator that it itself was a human, then it had the same level of intelligence as a human being. Now, I feel like communication is an effective way to evaluate another person's intelligence, because you know that they have their own thoughts, they have their own consciousness, or you're assuming that they have their own consciousness. So you can evaluate their intelligence by the way they're able to communicate with you. But it's flawed when you apply it to other things, like evaluate other things' intelligences based on communication, like computers or animals. So just because something can communicate doesn't necessarily mean that it is on the same intelligence level as you. So assuming this is flawed. And also, a computer itself is not thinking through the same way that you think through a conversation. It is receiving input and kind of dissecting it through its own system and then giving it output. So two, I guess, main examples of these kinds of instances in this flawed system, which I'm going to kind of discuss, is one is just a non-technological example, which is a chimpanzee that learned sign language, which I believe its name was Washoe. I didn't look up the exact pronunciation, but Washoe learned sign language, and it knew 150 different signs. And so it could effectively communicate whether it wanted food or whether it wanted a door opened or to that nature. But just because it knew what movements to make with its hands to get things to happen doesn't mean that it knows the words like we understand the language. It just knows, all right, if I make this movement with my hand, that door will open. Or if I make these movements with my hands, I will get food. It's not registering it and communicating the same way that we would use sign language with other people. And along the same lines of understanding language, Siri itself, it is understanding what you're saying in the sense that you can have a conversation with it, like, Siri, how's your day? And it will have a predetermined, all right, if the person asks how my day has been, it'll register that you're asking how the day's been, and it'll have an output. It's not registering a conversation the same way that you're registering a conversation. So, I guess, in conclusion, the Turing test is a good way to evaluate a person's ability, or a person's intelligence. So your ability to communicate is a good reflection of your own intelligence, but it is not an effective way to evaluate a computer's intelligence or an animal's intelligence. So applying this to a computer and artificial intelligence and evaluating just because it can communicate with you that it can also think like you is not an appropriate way to evaluate it just because it is receiving inputs and giving outputs. It's not thinking about it based on personal experience or emotions like you, a person,